Good evening and welcome. My name is David Fott. I'm professor of political science and director of the Great Works Academic Certificate Program at UNLV. The Great Works Academic Certificate Program exists to encourage undergraduates to spend as much time as they can with the greatest minds who've ever lived, from Karl Marx to Edmund Burke. And those are just the political types. There are those then in literature, science, and religion, and philosophy otherwise. The program requires 19 credits of courses. 18 credits of those are electives. They all feature primary sources written by authors on a 9-page single-spaced list available on our website. And then the other credit is a senior capstone seminar. It's a way to certify for you undergraduates that you've taken rigorous courses. It's a way to impress graduate schools and employers. We have at least one recipient of a certificate here tonight who's gone on to do very, very good things, who's gone on to graduate schools. I won't say more about the program here, but there are brochures on the front, on the arm of the front chair, there in the front seat. Professor Lutz is holding them up right now. Professor Lutz, my colleague in political science, he's on the faculty committee. So feel free to take one of those and speak with him or with me after the lecture. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, which is the home institution of our speaker. The lecture is part of the University Forum series, which is sponsored and funded by UNLV's College of Liberal Arts. Other sponsors are the UNLV Presidential Debate Campus Engagement Committee, 'tis the season, and the Great Works Program. Our speaker, Brian Anderson, is editor of City Journal, a cultural and political quarterly publication of the Manhattan Institute. He's the former senior editor of that publication and a former research associate at the American Enterprise Institute. Among his publications are Against the Obamanet, A Manifesto for Media Freedom, Democratic Capitalism and Its Discontents, Raymond Aron, The Recovery of the Political, and South Park Conservatives. His essays have appeared in many publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Weekly Standard, National Review, and Wilson Quarterly. The New York Times has described Dr. Anderson as one of the most probing and erudite essayists of our day. He holds a BA and an MA from Boston College and a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Ottawa. Dr. Anderson's topic tonight is both timeless, expect to hear reference to the state of nature, and intensely relevant to current events. Please join me in welcoming him to speak on Thomas Hobbes and Public Order.
Well, thank you for the generous introduction. Thanks to Professor Lott for the invitation and to the Great Works Program for hosting me. This is my first time in Las Vegas, actually, and I should have come prepared with lots of water because I feel like all the moisture has been sucked out of my body, but hopefully I can get through this without too many interruptions. A few decades ago, the American city was in a very profound crisis. Criminal violence and blight had spread like a plague, and this had made many neighborhoods zones of fear. Urban tax bases hemorrhaged. Even as tax rates were skyrocketing, productive workers and businesses were decamping for the suburbs. Millions of city dwellers seemed trapped in welfare dependency at the time. Schools had become educational deserts in many cities. Local politicians threw their hands up saying their dysfunctional cities needed massive state and federal aid just to keep the lights on. Many observers at the time described the American city as ungovernable. Now, few would say that today. During the 90s, effective leadership and innovative policies brought many American cities, though not all of them, back from the brink, and then unleashed what has been really 2 decades of urban success. Now, nowhere was this recovery more impressive than in New York City, where my magazine is located. But Gotham is far from alone. Cities have become the engine of national prosperity. They've given us countless new apps, gastronomic marvels, life-saving medical innovations, and much, much more. The Brookings Institution's Bruce Katz notes that the top 100 metropolitan areas in the United States are home to 2/3 of the country's population now, and more amazing still, 3/4 of American economic output. Thriving cities, the Harvard economist Edward Glaser has shown, ignite creativity by bringing entrepreneurial and idea-sharing people together. But an enormous, potentially city-destroying threat looms on the horizon. To avoid a second urban crisis, signs of which are now visible in Chicago, Baltimore, and many other major American cities, we need to remember the first one and what saved us from it. That first crisis proved nearly lethal. It had many causes, from economic and demographic shifts to foolish urban planning and social programs that encouraged dependency. But at its core was government's failure to ensure public safety. Crime in urban areas started to worsen after World War II, but it metastasized in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s as public leaders and police lost control of the streets. This was particularly the case in poor minority neighborhoods, where civic ties were already weaker. New York's most terrifying year, and it's hard to imagine if you visited New York City today, its most terrifying year was 1990, when 2,262 people were murdered in the city. That works out to 6 a day. More than 3,000 women were raped in New York that year, almost 9 a day on average. Aggravated assault was endemic. Robberies were more common still. The press was filled with stories about cold-blooded drive-by shootings and kids sleeping in bathtubs to protect them from stray bullets. And disorder sickened the city at that time, too. Living in New York meant fending off aggressive beggars on every corner. City parks were open-air drug markets. Commuters using Grand Central Terminal had to step over rows of homeless people to get to and from their trains. Graffiti was over everything, sending a constant message that society was breaking down. And when polled, a majority of New Yorkers at that time said they wanted to live somewhere else if they could just find a way to get out of the city. So small wonder that New York became a kind of a symbol in the early 90s of civilizational collapse. It was reflected in the dystopian movies of the day, like Escape from New York or Taxi Driver. You watch those movies today, it's like watching science fiction. You can't imagine it. But New York was on the way out. But if New York had gone farthest on this kind of road to ruin, other U.S. cities were also suffering similar problems. Now, this was an urban world that at its worst resembled Thomas Hobbes's State of Nature. In his 1651 masterwork, Leviathan, Hobbes describes what happens when public authority is absent or collapses. And he was writing against the backdrop of the English Civil War, as King Charles I's royalist forces fought Parliament supporters. It's a war that began in 1642, and as the people took sides, friendships and families were torn apart. In 1649, the parliamentarians chopped off Charles's head, Charles I, and eventually exiled his son, Charles II. But out of this ongoing terrible strife, which came to an end only in 1651, leaving over 200,000 dead and countless more casualties, a hard principle was established. The king governed only with parliamentary consent. Now, this bloody conflict cost Thomas Hobbes dearly on the personal level. As the war drums began to beat, he felt that his public position, he was a noted royalist, put his life in danger, so he fled to Paris, only returning to England when hostilities had ceased. And one of his dearest friends, the soldier beloved, Sidney Godolphin lost his life in a battle in 1643, causing Hobbes to suffer from what he called a weighty, lasting grief. He came to view lawlessness as the gravest of evils. Now, one needn't endorse Hobbes's political philosophy as a whole to recognize the plausibility of his account of what happens when order breaks down. It describes what many crime-plagued urban areas were like in the U.S. not so many years ago. Competition for goods or turf grows fierce. As Hobbes puts it, if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies. And in the way to their end, which is principally their own conservation and sometimes their delectation only, endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. Think of the gunfire and slaughter that marked out gang territory or rival drug markets in parts of New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. It's a pretty accurate description that Hobbes is providing. Even if one isn't covetous in this way, Hobbes adds, diffidence, the desire for security, can lead to preemptive aggression. So I need to get you before you get me. Violence and dread start to spread. Then there's what Hobbes calls glory, the vanity that can make a perceived or real insult and incitement to violence. For every man, Hobbes explains, looks that his companion should value him at the same rate he sets upon himself, and upon all signs of contempt or undervaluing, naturally endeavors, as far as he dares, to extort a greater value from his condemners by damage and from others by the example. A dis, as in disrespected, this is a term that entered common usage in the 1980s, was born from the honor battles that were making whole areas of our metropoles war zones. Now, if these three characteristics of human nature weren't enough to unleash mayhem in the absence of authority, Hobbes also points to what he called the privilege of absurdity, the unique human capacity to believe in one's own imaginings, which can lead us at times down dark paths. The political theorist Hannah Dawson puts it this way: Hobbes' state of nature is not the bland, game-theoretical clash of equally acquisitive individuals that is often supposed. Rather, it is a complex war set in motion by the needs of life and a kaleidoscope of desires that pattern human interaction. Now, continual fear rules under these kind of anarchic conditions. And as Hobbes famously put it, the life of man is rendered solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Horizons collapse, the spirit hardens, the future seems hopeless. This is not a good life. The political philosopher Kenneth Minogue points to the power of Hobbes' state of nature idea that we never quite escape its insecurities, as he puts it, whether in the Wild West or alone at night on a dark street, or, he adds, in certain inner cities at a certain point in American history. And make no mistake, the city of crime and disorder was the city of fear. Studies found half of all respondents and 60% of women afraid to walk city streets alone at night at this time, and about as many limiting their activities to keep from getting mugged. City residents rushed to their apartment building entrances, looking over their shoulders nervously. Don't make eye contact with strangers, you'd be advised by street-savvy types. Now, crime and disorder and the fear they engender attack what the urbanist Jane Jacobs calls the intricate ballet of street life, which serves as a kind of security mechanism itself, apart from public authority, in a functioning, properly functioning, prosperous, flourishing city. The city that is her vision of the good life, as her biographer Robert Canigal underscores in his new book. As Jacobs narrates in her 1961 classic, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, in a diversely organized neighborhood, that is a place with both residents and businesses densely mixed together, as was typical of older city areas, there will always be eyes on the street, looking out for potential threats to the community. She describes this unplanned, complex order evocatively in that book, using her own longtime neighborhood on Hudson Street in New York as an example. Anything strange, anything that might threaten the neighborhood will be noticed by these eyes on the street, and the people will come together to try to deter potential danger. Now, during the mid-20th century, city planners trying to eradicate blight and disorder had misguidedly tried to separate residential, commercial, and industrial uses of urban land. So these created areas all but void of street life at certain hours. In Jacobs's words, ideally suited for rape, muggings, beatings, holdups, and the like. So she fought ferociously with the planners, with considerable success. So the Jane Jacobs idea of a mixed-use urban neighborhood is now the standard taught in most urban design programs. But some urbanists took Jacobs's legitimate insight about flourishing neighborhoods and security and extended it too far, contending that eyes on the street were sufficient to ensure order, that neighborhoods could in effect self-police. This was wrong. When scared residents stayed inside, triple-locking their doors and shunning interaction with others, the eyes on the street looked away. Trust gave way to paranoia. Public space was surrendered to the enemies of civility. Now, Claude Brown, exploring Harlem in the mid-'80s for Harper's Magazine, explains how for residents of poorer neighborhoods, fear had turned into a way of life. This is him writing back in 1984. Nobody opens a door without first finding out who's there. In the early evening, you see people lingering outside, apartment houses, peeking in the lobbies. They seem to be casing the joint. They're actually trying to figure out who is in the lobby of their building. Is this someone waiting to mug me? Should I risk going in? Or should I wait for someone else to come? But if the poor in places like Harlem were the first and primary victims, the better off were not immune. As Saul Bellow put it in Mr. Samler's Planet, his description of 1970 New York, you opened a jeweled door into degradation from hyper-civilized Byzantine luxury straight into the state of nature. Now, crime, disorder, and fear made it harder for the urban poor to get ahead economically. In a 1986 essay, the then head of the National Institute of Justice, James Stewart, pointed out how less affluent city dwellers found themselves burgled more often, suffered the highest median economic losses from crime, were discouraged by danger of nighttime violence, from moonlighting, and watched the crime and fear tax drive neighborhood commerce out of business or out of town. Now, taking the subway in many cities became a considerable risk. Pickpockets, thugs, hunted the cars for potential victims. Ridership plummeted, further cutting off opportunity for the poor. The claim that poverty causes crime got things backward, warned Stewart. The vast majority of poor people, he maintained, are honest, law-abiding citizens whose opportunities for advancement are stunted by the drug dealers, muggers, thieves, rapists, and murderers who terrorize their neighborhoods, and are as oppressive as the most avaricious totalitarian regime. None of this would have surprised Hobbes, for whom industry, commodious building, arts and letters, science, and social flowering were predicated on security. No peace, no security, no society. So how did public order cave in so catastrophically after World War II? One explanation, in my view, is cultural, and the other has to do with misguided law enforcement policy. On the cultural front, urban leaders endorsed the poverty causes crime idea, the worldview that the violence ravaging neighborhoods was in fact a cry for justice, and that until America overcame inequality and racism and other social ills, high crime was unavoidable. Now, back in the 1980s, Washington, D.C.'s Mayor Marion Barry blasted the federal government for not pouring more financial aid into the violence-struck district. He gave blunt expression to this view. He said, "I'm not going to let murder be the gauge, since we're not responsible for murders. We can't stop the murders. Now, this was also an era during which some leading writers like Norman Mailer romanticized criminals as glamorous outlaws, overthrowing the conformity of society. And why punish victimless crimes like prostitution or graffiti anyway? Weren't such technically illegal acts signs of a kind of rude urban vitality? Now, to reclaim public space, urban leaders would need both to reject the criminals as victims conception and ignore the kind of radical chic intellectuals. As for law enforcement, the mid-20th century saw a disastrous change in police tactics. Police departments were encouraged to abandon the old-fashioned foot patrol, which reformers believe with some justification bred corruption, and shift instead to patrol by auto, which, obviously goes on in a city like this more regularly. This reduced interactions with the public and limited opportunities for bribes and shakedowns. So the perception was that this would reduce corruption, but the reformers also felt that it would be effective in terms of crime fighting. In fact, crime fighting would improve by moving rapidly and unpredictably through city streets. Police cars would signal that the cops were everywhere, reassuring law-abiding citizens and deterring the criminals, and perhaps even surprising or catching some criminals while they were breaking the law. Then you had technological developments like two-way radios and the 911 emergency line, which made rapid response the main criterion of urban policing success. How quickly could the police get to a call for help? Could they arrive at the scene of the crime in what became the standard 3 minutes or less? Well, this new approach, moving away from the kind of cop on the beat, the neighborhood cop, community cop, this new approach transformed policing into a mostly reactive enterprise. Police chased criminals after they'd already struck. Crime prevention, says criminologist George Kelling, was relegated to a small police unit that taught people about locks, alarms, and dogs to deter criminals from breaking in and entering their homes. Research would show that the reactive model was woefully ineffective. Few crimes ever got solved. Revolving door courts, under the sway of the then prevalent cultural view on crime, put many of the convicted back on the streets very quickly. Worse, with less direct contact with the public, the police in their cars became alienated from the communities they were supposed to serve. If Hobbes lived in the New York of the 1970s, philosophers Joseph Marin and Jason Grinnell contend, he might have named his great book not Leviathan, but Mayor, or Police Commissioner. Such was the failure of reactive law enforcement at that time and the need for a new policing model. Then something absolutely remarkable happened. The ungovernable, dying American city was brought back to life. A cultural and political shift occurred first. City voters, they got fed up with leaders unwilling or incapable of taming the streets. They began turning to hard-talking mayors like New York Democrat Ed Koch. I don't know how many of you remember him. He was elected in 1977 as mayor, and he ran promising to restore order. If you seek violence, he thundered, we will seek to put you in jail. Now, Koch and other first-wave reformers of this era failed to turn things around in the short term. As I had mentioned earlier, the worst year for New York was 1990, 2 years after Mayor Koch left office. But they helped change the public debate so that it suddenly seemed less hip to call violent criminals victims or Diogenes like rebels. National attitudes mirrored this trend. Another Democrat, Bill Clinton, ran for president in 1992, pledging federal funds to put more police on the streets. This as a response to black leaders of the time who were desperately demanding this. People forget this, but it was a very important moment in recent American political history. And judges, including on the Supreme Court, started to get tougher on crime. Civic groups formed to take back parks from drug pushers, prostitutes, and other agents of disorder. Firms pooled their resources to hire private security, scrub graffiti from storefronts, and remove sidewalk homeless encampments and get the mentally ill homeless into treatment. Jacobs's neighborhoods were, in other words, fighting back. But the most important development was policing, and it happened first in New York. Mayor Giuliani, first elected in '93, appointed William Bratton as his police chief, and it turned out to be an inspired choice. Bratton was and remains, he's just finished his second stint running the NYPD, a visionary. As head of the city's transit police, he had already driven down crime dramatically in New York's once fearsome subways, and now he would revolutionize policing across the city. The revolution had two components. The first was the introduction of proactive order maintenance, or what has come to be called broken windows policing. The approach is rooted in a social theory developed by Kelling and the political scientist James Q. Wilson, first advanced in The Atlantic magazine back in the early 1980s. They hypothesized a relationship between disorder and crime. If a city building neglected to replace its broken windows, they argued, it would be more likely to suffer further vandalization. The unrepaired window sent out a kind of social signal that no one cared, and so breaking more windows would cost nothing. The same held true of tolerating other so-called victimless crimes, whether turnstile jumping, public urination, aggressive panhandling, and other what are called quality of life offenses. It was these kind of violations that the public called the police about most often, not the more serious crimes, which even at their peak were far less common. Yet Kelling and Wilson predicted the unchecked disorder, the tolerated disorder, would eventually bring growing waves of deadlier crimes too, including rape, robbery, and murder, as the criminally inclined population felt empowered to act. So the victimless crimes weren't actually victimless after all. What we really didn't understand until the late 1980s and early 90s, Bratton recently told the urbanist Paul Romer, was that the victim of all the abhorrent behavior in the streets was the city itself. Now, from the moment Bratton took command of the NYPD, the police stopped ignoring quality of life offenses. And once the cops start writing citations for, and sometimes booking, although they didn't often send these people to jail, but they were writing citations for fare beaters, public drunks, squeegee men, they discovered that these crimes, these petty criminals really, were often wanted for much more serious crimes. And so they removed them from the streets on those charges. So the squeegee guy was also somebody they were looking for an assault. There was a continuum between petty crime and graver crime, just as the broken windows theory posited. Now, some criminologists have disputed the mechanism at the heart of the theory, but behavioral research continues to provide evidence for it. In a Dutch field example, and there's been many of these experiments done, envelopes stuffed with euros were placed so that they protruded from two mailboxes. Now, one mailbox was scrubbed clean, the other was covered with graffiti and surrounded by litter. For the clean mailbox, 13% of people walking by stole the euros. For the dirty mailbox, 27% grabbed the money, a quite dramatic difference. And other tests have produced like outcomes. What this says is that cultural signals they influence behavior. Now, the second part of this revolution, if the first was in tactics, the second was in management. With the help of key deputies, Bratton implemented a new planning and accountability system called CompStat. And during weekly meetings, the NYPD executives would bring in local precinct heads. They would all get together, look at current crime data projected on an electronic map, going street by street to see what was happening in an up-to-the-minute way, and then put the local commander on the spot for what he would do about it. So we see a rash of robberies taking place on this street. What are you going to do about it so that you come back here next week and report again? have you solved the problem? Have you figured out at least what's going on? This kind of pattern recognition allowed the police for the first time to use resources rationally in higher crime environments, sending extra cops to a neighborhood, hit with a pattern of rape or assault. And the system established far greater accountability. The commanders who repeatedly failed to address problems or tried to fudge data would find themselves replaced. So both broken windows policing and the new management methods put a renewed accent on preventing crime, not reacting to it, and getting cops back into contact with the community, taking its pulse. Now, what followed staggers the imagination. Murders in New York City plunged 56% in just 6 years. As Bratton's successors as police chief after he stepped down in '96 kept up with these innovations. And then they kept falling, right through the 3 terms of the administration of Mayor Michael Bloomberg and under his top cop, Ray Kelly, and into the new mayoralty of Bill de Blasio, where Bratton had come back to serve again. So that today, murder in New York City is down 84% from its 1990 peak. Now, thousands of lives, most of them minorities living in poorer neighborhoods where crime fell by far the most, were saved. And it wasn't just murders. Felonies overall plummeted 78% over the same period, and New York could suddenly call itself America's safest big city. And with order reestablished, the city surged with newfound vigor. So neighborhoods blossomed, tourists flooded in, as did young and ambitious new residents, eager to participate in the reinvented ballet of New York street life. Brooklyn became the hipster capital of the world. Harlem pulsed with black-owned businesses like Marcus Samuelson's trend-setting restaurant Red Rooster. Even the Bronx, the New York borough where one most feared to tread at one point in time, saw its population expand, its economy grow, so that today it has more jobs than it has had at any time in its history. And preventative, data-driven policing of this kind soon spread to other departments across the country, as top NYPD deputies became police chiefs in other major cities, including in Los Angeles, where Bratton went in 2002, taking over the LAPD and transformed it utterly. Crime proceeded to fall in Los Angeles by numbers almost as impressive as were seen in New York. Downtown LA, formerly broken down and scary, was recently pronounced America's next great city by GQ magazine. Now, some cities didn't recover. Detroit, with 1/11th of New York's population, but just as many yearly murders, seems doomed despite heroic local civic and law enforcement efforts. But other cities fared much better as crime fell nationally by almost 50%. Now, America's urban renewal over the last quarter century isn't solely due to greater safety, but the reduction of crime and fear played an essential role. And though other factors may have contributed to that crime turnaround, everything from an improving economy to a reduction of lead in the environment to the spread of video games has been advanced as a potential cause or potential causes of the crime drop. I think the most persuasive research and common sense shows that it was really a feat accomplished and maintained in at least significant part by the nation's law enforcement community. So, unfortunately, a new urban crisis threatens. Safety, which has been taken for granted by many people too young to have experienced the bad streets of a quarter century ago, is again at risk. And the main reason is the rising influence of an anti-law enforcement movement. It comprises advocacy groups, major press outlets, and politicians. It's making the argument that an out-of-control, racist police community is oppressing minorities and provoking conflicts that then culminate in police violence. Now, one of the movement's main goals is to end proactive policing, which it charges unfairly target poor minorities. Now, triggered by 2 high-profile incidents in 2014, the fatal police shooting of Michael Brown, who's a black teenager in Ferguson, Missouri, and the heart attack and death of another African-American, Eric Garner, after cops forcibly arrested him on Staten Island, New York, for selling illegal cigarettes. The campaign has ignited riotous confrontations between blacks and police that have left whole neighborhoods in cinders in many cities. Several officers have been assassinated by killers claiming to be motivated by the movement. And as my Manhattan Institute colleague Heather McDonald has been arguing, the movement's unabating rhetoric, anti-police rhetoric, has increasingly demoralized urban police who've begun to back away from aggressive policing in minority neighborhoods. Better to go back to reactive policing, these officers seem to be thinking. Isn't that what everyone seems to be telling them to do anyway? What's happened is terrifying. It's a kind of bloodbath. Since the end of 2015, per capita homicide rates in Baltimore had climbed to an all-time high, and violence was spiking in Cleveland, Milwaukee, Houston, Chicago, Los Angeles, here in Las Vegas, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., and many other U.S. cities. Indeed, murders in America's 50 largest cities rose almost 17% in 2015. This was the biggest burst of urban violence in a quarter century. The outbreak was severe enough that the Major Cities Chiefs Association called an emergency meeting, and the consensus among the gathered law enforcement officials was that a Ferguson effect, a term popularized by McDonald in an influential Wall Street Journal editorial, was to blame, as criminals felt emboldened by the newly reactive policing and the anti-law enforcement climate. The FBI's latest data, which just came out a couple of weeks ago, show an 11% rise nationwide in homicide. That's the largest countrywide increase in nearly 50 years. Now, the victims of this violence, again, have mostly been African Americans, just as was true in the pre-proactive policing days, as former President Bill Clinton recognized in lashing out at an anti-police protester during a recent campaign appearance for Hillary. "Tell the truth," Bill Clinton said. "You were defending the people who caused young people to go out and take guns." Now, are there racist cops? Of course. But the idea that the cops are waging a war against African Americans or other minorities isn't supported by the evidence. A Washington Post analysis concluded that blacks made up 26% of the 1,000 or so deaths by police shooting last year nationwide. That's above the 13% representation of blacks in the population. But as residents of many poor African American neighborhoods will attest, violent crimes are today disproportionately committed by their neighbors, other blacks. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, blacks were charged with 62% of all robberies, 57% of murders, and 45% of assaults in America's 75 largest counties in 2009, the most recent year they have data for, though they made up roughly 15% of the population in those places. Now, one of the benefits of the policing revolution, as I argued, is the rational deployment of resources to where crime is taking place, which means every citizen is treated more equally than in the days when many urban areas were allowed to become hellscapes. But that means more police presence in high-crime minority neighborhoods and inevitably more encounters with potentially violent criminals. On rare occasions, bad police judgments, tragic mistakes, or outright criminal actions by rogue cops can harm innocent people. There needs to be a lot of serious thinking about how to reduce these kind of incidents, but going back to 1990 is only going to ensure that a lot more innocent people get killed by crime. And nor can a plausible claim be made that broken windows policing is unjust or anti-minority. Should police just ignore the calls they receive from law-abiding residents of poor neighborhoods to do something about the drug dealers on, loitering in front of their buildings, or the drunks screaming outside their windows at 3 in the morning? These are the kind of things that people in suburbia expect. And you go to a police community meeting in the Bronx or Harlem, you'll hear, why can't you put a patrol on my block to get rid of those prostitutes? Where are the cops? Polling data in New York, even after the Garner incident, suggests continued African American support for public order policing. The depolicing trend is also going to be reinforced, this is another topic, by out-of-whack municipal finances. You know, our cities are hurtling toward a big fiscal problem because of unaffordable pensions, and it's already starting to reduce the money available that cities have to pay for city services, whether it's welfare services or putting police on the street. And this problem is just going to get worse and worse and worse. You know, as pension spending consumes a rising chunk of city budgets. No great city, still great American city, is in more trouble from these twin forces, escalating crime, crashing fiscal reality, than Chicago. Homicides and shootings have exploded in that city to rates unseen for 2 decades. As of early September, murders were up 50% over the same period in 2015, which was also up about 30%, and shootings have risen by roughly the same percentage. Again, almost all the victims are young black males. The Chicago PD, swept up in accusations of being systematically hostile toward minority communities, has seemingly ceded those communities to criminal gangs. Pedestrian stops in Chicago have dropped over 80%. So the police are just not policing. You know, the Democratic Mayor Rahm Emanuel has pledged to put 500 more cops on the streets of Chicago, try to reverse the situation, but that is going to threaten the city's future, and their pension situation is the worst in the country out of big cities. So it's, you know, it's no surprise that Metro Chicago's population has shrunk by more than 6,000 people last year. That was one of the worst performances of any major metro in the country. Chicagoans, I think, are seeing what's coming, and a lot of them are starting to think of heading for the exits. Now, none of this, in conclusion, none of this is inevitable. We can reaffirm the principles of the policing tactical and managerial revolution against its critics while working to improve training and community relations between police and minority neighborhoods, increase transparency, that's very, very important, and make sure that bad cops, legitimately bad cops, are swiftly removed and prosecuted. We can find smarter ways, too, to provide government services, more affordable ways to do it, and good retirement benefits for government workers at more reasonable costs. But the future of America's crisis is cloudier, I think, than many people realize. Future of America's cities. Now, in sum, Jane Jacobs' buzzing, life-enhancing neighborhood life is predicated on the hard truths of Thomas Hobbes. Jacobs herself acknowledged this in a 1993 interview included in a brand new volume of her shorter writings that's just come out called Vital Little Plans. All civilized governments, she says, must strive constantly to monopolize vengeance and force. To the extent they don't succeed, private murders or extortions, robberies, organized crime, terrorist groups, vigilantes, lynching mobs, or the like, civilization and its securities have broken down. Of course, governments can be uncivilized themselves in their use of force. That's all too clear. But that doesn't negate the need for government monopoly over force in civilized regimes. It was a strikingly Hobbesian observation. Without security, the civil society that has characterized so many American cities in recent years will increasingly be replaced by something like a civil war. Thank you. And Las Vegas is a city where the crime situation is getting a lot worse, especially violent crime. I don't know what the exact percentage is. It's up here, but at one point I think it was up 60% year on year. Now, obviously, it's a smaller city than a place like New York or Chicago. But anyway, I'd be happy to take any of your questions.
Yes, Mr. Saperstein.
Taking the case of Las Vegas, starting in 2009, I believe, the Atlantic had a paper regarding Australian police force educating the Las Vegas force. In New York in post-1990s, do you see the influence of other countries?
In terms of policing methods?
Yeah.
I think it's been the reverse. I think the NYPD has been considered, the best and most professional police force in the world. So they've sent their people everywhere. They were the department that's always been on the kind of cutting edge over the last 25 years of better community relationships. And it's significant, I think, that the huge crime surge you see in a lot of American cities, most of the big cities, has not yet happened in New York, where crime is at historic lows still. Now Bratton just stepped down. We'll see if that continues. The departments can drift, they can develop bad cultures, but the NYPD is, and they're of course studying other departments to see what's working. A lot of very, very bright people work for a big force like that. That's not the case with a lot of smaller forces where you don't have the same degree of professionalism. And that's where sometimes you do get, you get problems with bad behavior on the part of cops and bullying behavior and the lack of sensitivity and lack of community outreach. So there does need to be a lot of work on that school. What's the public perception of the Las Vegas police? Are they pretty popular here? Somebody was telling me was it you or maybe Steve Bates that they solve a strikingly high percentage of their prosecutions, which is often a good sign. Any more questions? Yes, in the back.
Could you talk a little bit about the influence of, you talked about Bratton a little bit, a big reason that his techniques were kind of successful is that he used a controversial technique, stop and frisk.
Right.
Now, we've seen from the data that that's somewhat of a racist technique. We know that it's applied against, say, a black guy in Bronx, but not a white kid in Park Slope. So in a way, I feel like it is solving a problem in that the environment may seem better, but all we've really done in a way is shifted, and I think in a lot of ways, in a racist sort of way, young African Americans into this criminal justice system. So,
well, I think the stop and frisk was in part a response to community demand. It was calls from communities that there were too many guns on the streets and that the kids were all packing heat. And so the cops began to, stop, question, and frisk more what they deemed to be suspicious-looking behavior in these communities. They got a lot of guns off the streets. Bratton was not the main practitioner of that. It was, in fact, the NYPD under Ray Kelly and Michael Bloomberg that embraced that tactic more aggressively. Bratton came back under de Blasio saying he could keep crime down while reducing the number of stop and frisks, which were creating friction points in the communities. So far that seems to be working. But again, it was really a case of the police responding to where crime was taking place. So they were flooding neighborhoods which were getting hit by robberies, hit by assaults, and shootings, and they cut shootings in New York by almost 90%. So these minority areas of the city, which were plagued by high crime levels, have really come back. You go to the Bronx today. I lived in the Bronx. When I first came to New York, it was kind of a tough area still. This was in the mid '90s where this kind of policing shift was just beginning. But these days, you've got tourists going there. There's more people employed than at any time in its history. It's just amazing what's happened. Even in the South Bronx, you see a lot of commerce, and kids can go to school and not be worried about getting shot. So, stop and frisk is distinct from broken windows policing It's distinct from community policing. It is a particular method. All police use some kind of stop and frisk. You can't police without doing it. An argument can be made that the NYPD grew too reliant on it, but they've backed away from that. And that started, to come down pretty aggressively in the last years of Ray Kelly. He was already moving away from it. And when you completely abandon it, as we've seen in Chicago, that's what, when I said they've stopped they've cut their street stops by 80%, that means they're not stopping and frisking anybody. And the result has been a massive escalation in violence. So, if there's other ways to stop that violence from happening, I'm all ears. And the New York experience is promising, but here's another thing. The NYPD has almost 40,000 police officers, so it's a small army. And so Bratton, the tactic he developed to get away from stop and frisk was to use the crime data, very sophisticated algorithms that they're developing to predict where crime is going to take place, kind of minority report style, and then flood neighborhoods with all of this extra manpower they have. And the cops would just stand around in that area, but it seems to be kind of working to deter crime right now. But, if you poll New Yorkers, they're saying that the city feels scarier and more dangerous now. I don't know, it's not showing up in the crime data yet, and hopefully it will. Any more questions? How many of you are from urban backgrounds, live in cities? I mean, how are the cops polite here? Like New Yorkers, New York cops can be real jerks. So they're working on that to try to get them to be more respectful. Like the couple of times I've been pulled over by a cop, I get really angry. And so you can certainly see the kind of friction points in areas where, they're harassing some black kid and something happens. So it's got to be better, better training. And I think police forces are working on it. Yeah.
All right, I love the speech, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm a prior service military. 1996, 2004, I moved here in 2005. I was stopped by the police walking with two of my associates. I fit the description. And like the gentleman remarked about the stop and frisk, they did question first.
Right.
So there is a process, and I believe a little bit of respect for the Constitution. But I think more respect for the Constitution in relation to the Fourth, Amendment, as privacy.
Yeah.
Could help, but then there's also opportunity that low-income people, take. So I'm just kind of taking it on the chin. It's okay.
Well, it's as I said in my talk, you don't want to go back to 1990 policing because that's going to mean what we're starting to see in Chicago, and that's not good for anybody. But I'm hopeful that this kind of method that Bratton has deployed in New York might be possible in other police departments. Criminologists are coming up with the big data revolution is coming up with some scary ways of predicting crime, and it's the LAPD has started deploying this, and it's they don't focus on individuals, but they focus on particular areas. And so this particular corner under these atmospheric conditions is going to have a 60% probability that there's going to be an attempted robbery. And LA has been testing this out. NYPD is testing this out now too. They, in the areas where they've been using this new method, crime has been going down more than in areas where they haven't been using it. So it does seem to have some predictive effect. That can obviously give rise to, if it focuses on individuals and somebody's never committed a crime but fits the description of being a criminal, then you are in a minority report territory. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie or read that book. Yes?
What you were saying on fitting the description of the criminal, because I believe this was very back on the first question that he had. It wasn't so much of what you were saying in terms of not, it's not that they're profiling racially, they're just profiling people with suspectable behavior. And I was just wondering, could you go in a little detail on that? Because I've been stopped and frisked. Sometimes they've asked questions, sometimes they haven't. Sometimes they've been really aggressive. In terms of maybe people that look a particular way.
Yeah.
Grooming methods. I have braids. My hair is long. Or people that are dressed a particular way. That's not necessarily behavior, but more of those type of patterns. And I don't have a record. I graduated from UNLV. A lot of times they're aggressive with me, profiling, and once they see I'm a UNLV student, it actually intimidates them, and then that's when their behavior changes.
Right.
So I was wondering, could you just go in a little bit
Yeah,
more
it's, as I said, there's going to be cops who are rushing to judgment. Certainly, I think a lot of the problem is tragically that the black violent crime rate is very high. And so that unfairly extends suspicion to other African Americans. And for cops trying to figure out who's the guy they're looking for, if they're looking for a shooter in a particular neighborhood who fits a certain description, is dressed a certain way, they're going to be making difficult judgment calls. And that's why respect is absolutely crucial in terms of training, and looking, assume. I mean, my kid dresses like a hip hop. It's all he does is listen to hip hop music, talks a lingo. It's embarrassing, but he hasn't been stopped by the cops. A black kid acting that way probably would be in my town. So it is a problem. I don't have an answer to that. Other than to say I think better training of police. But as the gentleman said over in the corner, also, black kids have to be aware that, especially if they're living in a high crime area, that they're going to have to watch out that they don't fall into a situation where the cops are going to be suspecting them of something. I don't think there's an easy answer for it. But one thing that's happening now, it's a country of 300 million people. Every single incident that is occurring between police and minority communities that goes awry, is now being made national news. And these incidents have been very different. Some of them are absolutely unjustified. The shooting of the kid, Lachlan McDonald in Chicago, is horrific, but the cop is being prosecuted for murder there. But this Charlotte incident seems to be justified, and it was an African-American cop who shot the kid, or the guy. But they're different. They're different circumstances in each case, and weaving them all together as if they're telling one story, I think, is a mistake. Very different departments, very different methods. Yeah.
Does New York implement any psychological programs for the police officers that are in the more urban areas compared to the suburban areas to help out with that?
Yeah, they're really trying to focus. We're working on an article looking at new methods of training cops for conflict situations. I don't know if you call it psychological.
No, I mean like the psychological training after a bunch of conflicts. I mean, they're going to have conflict after conflict more in the urban areas.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, they try to move the police around a lot into different roles and different. The city has a big anti-terrorism. The NYPD is kind of its own entity in that sense. They can do things because of their size and the number of things they do, including terrorism, fighting terrorism that allows those kind of deployments. But they do all sorts of training in terms of conflict resolution. I guess that's how I put it. And they're trying to expand that. So that does have a psychological component. For guys who've been on the streets for a long time and were getting battle-hardened and cynical, that is a problem. They get burned out. But a lot of cops retire pretty early, so they're out of there when they're in their 40s. So not many of them last then. Beyond a certain point. Yes?
So if hiring new cops and increasing the police force is like essential to reaffirming like proactive policing, then how do you ensure that like these new cops don't turn into parties into like the Eric Garner or Sandra Brown situation?
Well, I think it does come down to training. You know, Chicago is the department that's trying to put more cops in the street because New York still has, as I mentioned, almost 40,000 police officers, so they're not expanding the NYPD. They've in fact cut their ranks because of the pension issue. They can't afford to put as many on the streets, so the department's shrinking, but it's still orders of magnitude bigger than most departments. But Chicago is understaffed. They need more cops. You know, it does come down to training. I don't think it's, you know, the Chicago PD has had a lot of problems with transparency, a lot of, you know, they close ranks, they don't talk to the public very much. That's been a lot of their problem. You know, but there's some good cops there. They've brought crime down there by 35%, I think, until this recent resurgence. So it's not just in the numbers that you're putting on the street, it's how these cops are going to be deployed. And Chicago, I think, needs to do more community outreach. You know, right now they're doing the opposite. They're doing community pullback and just not policing. And so that's a big issue. Yes, in the back row?
It's a bit off the subject, but what's been the effect of the CCTV on city streets?
Well, this does get to the privacy question. You know, it doesn't seem to deter crime that much, but it is allowing law enforcement to catch people because everybody's being. In New York, you were just constantly under surveillance. London, you were constantly under surveillance. This has been the case since 9/11. You know, it doesn't seem to deter the impulsive criminal acts, but I think it is having an effect on more rational criminals who are, you know, they're moving out of the drug sales in the city have moved out of the parks. They've moved to private transactions in buildings, so that they're not, you know, the drug dealer will come to your apartment and deliver, which is, you know, it's much better for the city because it really reduces the violence that was going on as deals went bad or drug dealers got into gunfights for territory. But I don't know, I'm a little creeped out by all of the cameras. You know, you're just constantly under surveillance everywhere. And I do think it at least raises some privacy issues. Yes, in front?
You mentioned that you think that Chicago should have more community outreach.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if, do you think it would lead us to like lead into neighborhood cops maybe riding on circuit, like having different shifts or something like that?
Yeah, I think you know, you want cops involved in the communities. You want the communities to recognize the police officers. Now, that was the original ideal of policing, that the police were representatives of the public. And you know, the Chicago PD, I don't think does a very good job of that. This is something that Bratton, when he went to the LAPD, which had a very bad reputation, you may not remember the Rodney King riots, and you know, it was a racist police force in a lot of ways, very aggressive, it was kind of like the Chicago PD is now, not open to the public at all. And he really transformed it to the point that when he left town, I think 2008, at the LA Times, which was originally very hostile to him, did a whole week of editorials saying what a remarkable job he had done. And one thing he did there was really bring in the minority neighborhoods. So he had representatives work with local black leaders and Asian leaders, Hispanic leaders in the city. He really got a lot of buy-in from the communities. we cut crime there almost as much as it fell in New York, and helped downtown revive, downtown LA. It's very, very prosperous. It used to be a very high crime area. But, he's a kind of unique guy, and, the smaller city police departments may not have that kind of talent. Yes?
What specifically are the other hallmark strategies of Bratton's policing system besides the famous or infamous stop and frisk?
Well, he wasn't the inventor of stop and frisk. Stop and frisk is just something, all stop and frisk is what police do when they see suspicious behavior.
Yeah.
They had constitutional permission to do this. I forget the name of the Supreme Court decision. And Bratton deployed it in a fairly limited way when he was at the NYPD. It increased dramatically under Michael Bloomberg's administration. It helped drive crime down more, but at the cost, I think, of community friction. What Bratton did was proactive policing, you'd call it. So it included community outreach, what you would call community policing. It included the broken windows idea, which I just described, which the NYPD is still doing. In other words, going after minor lawbreakers, not allowing them to, sell drugs on a street corner, or not allowing prostitutes to work openly in public. Didn't necessarily mean arresting these people, but writing citations, moving them along, creating police presence. And then the third and probably most important of the Bratton tactics was managerial, was to transform the managerial structure, to make cops accountable for their precincts using data to crime map. So you would see where the crimes were taking place in real time, and then deploy your police department's forces and resources rationally based on where crime was taking place. It used to be the case, there was a hip-hop song from Public Enemy, 911 is a joke. It was about how, black neighborhoods in New York City just had no relationship with cops. And they were unpoliced. The South Bronx was unpoliced for a long time. They just let people kill each other. And that was very, very bad for the city. It was obviously very bad for all the people who lost their lives. So this kind of accountability system, crime mapping, that meant that every New Yorker was going to be treated equally when it came to the police. Crime fell most dramatically in minority neighborhoods because that's where most of the crime was taking place. Yes?
One of the criticisms of the Ferguson area was the fact that only 2% of the police force were African American, and I think it was over 50% of the population is African American. How important do you think that diversifying the police force is, especially in these high crime areas?
I think a white or Asian cop doesn't necessarily have to be viewed as a kind of alien presence in a black neighborhood or a black officer in a white neighborhood. I think the disparity in Ferguson is probably too much. Certainly, the NYPD is much more diverse. LAPD much more diverse. A lot of black officers, Asian officers, Muslim officers. 2%, 50% breakdown, I don't know. I think it depends on how the cops are. And it sounds like some of the Ferguson cops were jerks, and racists. But not all of them. And most of them, if you get to know police officers, most of them, especially working in high crime, big cities, they go into it to do good. They're very idealistic, a lot of these kids who are coming out of the police academy. They're not racists, they want to help people. Some of them get hardened in working in cities, and then you're going to get your bad cops occasionally. Departments need to figure out better ways maybe of weeding those kind of people out, figuring out if they have a propensity to violence. Now, the NYPD almost never draws its guns anymore. That's the other thing that has been lost in this whole recent debate about policing. Police departments used to be way more violent. They were shooting people all the time back in the 70s and 80s. You know, the NYPD they don't shoot their guns, you know, almost ever. Some cops wind up never pulling their guns. You know, and that's a function of, or a result of the lowering of crime in the city, which has also emptied out the prisons. You know, crime, New York's prisons and jails have far fewer people in them now than they did 20 years ago. Just plummeted. In fact, they're so empty upstate, where they used to ship prisoners from New York City, that the prisons in upstate New York are now basically empty. The jobs programs for people working up there. So I live in a town in Westchester where Sing Sing prison is, and there's been some rumors that they're going to close Sing Sing and transfer some of the population to these upstate prisons in order to keep the jobs for people up there. You know, upstate New York is very economically, it's a tough area these days, not doing well. But you know, you have to do outreach in minority communities to get officers, you know, people who want to join the academy. They may have a problem with that, Ferguson side. You know, I can't speak about the details of it just in that circumstance. I know the New York Police Department really does aggressively try to find, you know, good cops from every community in the city. They have a lot of, for example, Muslim officers who can speak various languages. It really improves their counter-terror capacity. It's a real model. It's considered a model. It's as good as the FBI in terms of fighting terror. I feel safer when the NYPD is involved in a terrorism situation than I do with the federal government. Yes?
Do you think the war on drugs is an overused state, or do you think that
The war on drugs is...
War on drugs, is that like, do you think that's, I just want to know your opinion, if you think it's well monitored, or if it's sensitive?
I think, you know, New York has recently decriminalized pot. Just writing citations for it now, unless you sell it. I don't know, you know, I'm kind of a hardliner on drugs. I see a lot of the destruction it does. I don't know. I've been thinking about that. I'm not with Milton Friedman and other libertarians who think you should basically deregulate it all. I think that's an utopian view. You know, there's another myth that is circulating, though, is that our prisons are filled with nonviolent drug offenders. This is absolutely untrue. You know, the getting to prison is still a kind of lifetime achievable in the United States. There's very, very few of these guys or women in prisons are there who haven't got a long track record of committing crimes, and usually violent crimes, or selling a lot of drugs. Anyway, I think I'm... Thank you, yeah. My pleasure, and thank you again for the invitation and for the very thoughtful questions.